It's hard not to fall in love with this spot, isn't it, when you're first here? It's just a wonderful, beautiful open space, and no matter what you like, whether it's a dog walk or climbing on the cliffs or geology or bird watching, or history, I think everyone's got something that they can come to Berryhead and really enjoy.
As soon as I went up there, I couldn't believe how beautiful it was and how I didn't know it was there the whole time. And then I was introduced to these porpoises. I had no idea that we got marine life like that, big marine megafauna, so close to the shore and so regularly.
That's what really got me. That got me hooked, going to Berryhead and witnessing migration in action as birds arrive from Africa, perhaps in the winter time, or arriving in the autumn from Scandinavia.
Well, Berryhead was designated as a country park. It is a very, very important area of land because originally, geologically, it was in fact actually south of the equator as a coral reef. And that was about 410 million years ago, 375 million years. Fascinating headland to the extent of it has many conservation designations because of being limestone, Devonian limestone, and it is sea cliff grasslands as well. So what you are getting is major important plants that are at their northernmost extreme growing, 5 in particular. But you've also got man's use of Berryhead, and that is in fact the example that is on Berryhead at the present moment will be Napoleonic, which is 1800 on 1795 to about 1810 in fact. So the great big forts constructed there.
It's a very well used site, so we get thousands and thousands of people here, especially with the COVID and everyone holidaying in the UK. So we've got, at the moment, it's been a real struggle with just the amount of rubbish and sort of behaviours, shall we say, that we don't want to see on site. So a lot of drone flying, a lot of antisocial behaviour when it comes to the fishing, people camping on sites and things like that. So we're struggling with the human side of it at the moment. The main issue would possibly be the fishing. Okay, we have very large groups of people going down fishing, which again causes a lot of mess down in the quarry, and a lot of people camping there, a lot of fires and things like that. So that creates quite a lot for us to have to deal with in the sense of managing that, and constantly going down, asking people to leave, not being able to camp there and to take their tents away, but also all the mess that's left from human waste through to rubbish and everything else. So the easiest thing to do would be banning it, but then obviously we'd have to, as rangers, police that, which we just aren't resourced to, and really probably we're not qualified to do really as well.
Because of what is going on in the rest of the local area with dog bans to do with parks and gardens and beaches and things like this, the numbers of dogs and dog walkers on Berryhead has increased. And this is where the defecation of the dogs in fact actually creates possible soil change and soil condition changes, which then will affect the botanical side of the actual headland.
Absolute peak season, when it's a perfect weather and there's tourists around everywhere, we're probably looking at over 1,000 people are up on the headland. And at those times we still have a lot of those same dog walkers and a few other local dog walkers who don't come out on such the worst days, but then we get a lot more tourists and holiday makers, and also just families who live nearby coming out in the summer.
During any given time that I spend up at Berryhead, which can be between 2 or 4 hours, I probably see anywhere up to 10 to 100 dogs. It's a really popular dog walking spot. And some people have more than one, so lots.
There are some people who have 2 or 3 or 4 dogs, and yeah, that's quite unusual. Most people have 1 or occasionally 2 dogs, if they have a dog, yeah. And that's one of the main reasons that we find people come to our cafe, is because the dogs. The other factor right now to consider is that because there's sheep in this pocket of this fort, then dogs have to be on a lead in this area. So a lot of dog walkers might choose actually not to come into the North Fort for these few weeks. They might just turn around when they get to the gates there and go somewhere else, because there's plenty of other areas where they can run around off the lead.
We do get a problem with the dog fouling, especially now as well, because dog ownership's soared. It's the vast majority of people do pick up their dog mess, but especially at this time of year is becoming again a bit of an issue. You can see a lot of it around.
Yeah, generally the dog walkers are not really aware of what's going on, and they don't seem to be aware of disturbing, what if they are disturbing anything at all. I think they just go there to walk the dogs and that's it. One or two of them are interested, and I have to say, when I walk around Berryhead, there's, of the ones I see regularly and I know now very well, they are interested in the birds, and they will certainly try and keep the dogs away from areas when you're watching something. So if they see you watching a bird, they'll turn the dog around and go somewhere else. Others are completely oblivious to that and just walk straight in front of you.
It's looking at the people who come with many dogs, and they have to understand as well that it's selfish of them to actually continue to use the headland as their dog walking zone. And quite often the people with the amount of dogs that are in fact actually possibly licensed dog walkers, who take dog walks. But also over and above that, there are one or two people who are breeders who come with all their dogs.
We speak to the dog warden quite a lot, but again, she's very tied because she looks after the whole of Torbay. So it's very difficult for her to be able to come out and catch people. As soon as they see the van, they know, and they either go somewhere where she's not, or they actually pick it up.
To tackle the problem, you will probably have to reduce the numbers of dogs being walked by individuals. But over and above that, it's probably a bigger presence on site of the management, the rangers, who are then kind of interacting with people to do with picking up the dog mess and everything.
So again, maybe the government getting better at sort of doing dog registration and stuff like that. I'd like to see dogs' DNA tested, to be honest, and then they can test the dog poo and send the fines to whoever it is that's left it there. But I mean, that'll never happen, because that's an infinite amount of money to do that sort of thing.
You could say total ban, but it would be the conflict would be enormous, and therefore the management for the headland would be that much more difficult because of that. And getting people on side, it's looking much more closely to possibly the fact that people should only be walking possibly one or two dogs.
For me, it's the migration during the spring and during the autumn that really got me hooked, and witnessing the birds coming through, sometimes in huge numbers, so maybe thousands. In one instance, there were 15,000 redwing migrating over the top of Berryhead. I've witnessed tens of thousands of wood pigeons passing through, and to see that spectacle for me is something really interesting. In the springtime you struggle a bit, the birds come through in smaller numbers, but to see a fine male wheatear just arrive back from North Africa in its spanking spring plumage, ready to move on and start breeding, is just a sight. For me, it's a wonderful sight.
Well, Berryhead's one of those particular places where it is crucially important for especially bird species. It is a migration route, so you're getting birds coming in during the spring and also going out from Berryhead. And these would be birds like wheatears, whitethroats, things like that.
But you've also got species like sorrel-bunting, which are only found really effectively in South Devon. They've been reintroduced into Cornwall, but the whole of the population was along the south coast of Devon. And Berryhead holds several pairs, and it's always nice to go to Berryhead and see the sorrel-buntings. If ever I take a group of people out there, that's one of the species they really want to see. When I first started going to Berryhead, there were no sorrel-buntings there at all. But from conservation work, their numbers have built up over the years. From the early 80s and late 70s, when I first started bird watching, they were quite a rare bird. Although they were only found in Devon, they were still a rare bird in Devon. Now the numbers have increased dramatically, and we now have breeding pairs at Berryhead. The sorrel buntings certainly like long grass. During the springtime they feed their young almost entirely on crickets and grasshoppers, other invertebrates as well, but crickets and grasshoppers are the main prey. And really they're just leaving a few areas left to go a little bit wild to encourage the grasshoppers and invertebrates for the sorrel buntings to go and feed on. If we can retain those birds during the winter time and keep them in good condition, they will probably stay and breed during the summertime the next year. There are plenty of other species breeding over there. There's linnets, there's goldfinches, there's stonechats.
But also seabirds especially, because on the cliffs of Berryhead you have a breeding colony of a small bird called the guillemot. It is a seabird and it's a member of the auk family. But Berryhead is the southernmost extreme of this particular species of bird breeding. And on Berryhead, back in the 80s and mid-80s, there were only about 440 odd birds. We know this because we actually counted the birds. And now, at present, there are around about 1,500 breeding on the cliffs of Berryhead.
The most important bird at Berryhead will be certainly the guillemots with the huge colony there. It's the biggest colony in the whole of the south coast of England, so they are really the most important species of bird at Berryhead.
And it's the geology of the cliffs is why the bird comes here to breed, because there are the ledges. The bird doesn't build a nest, it actually lays a pear-shaped egg actually on the cliffs, on these small ledges.
You get the disturbance of the colony, so people coming in too close with boats, often unaware of what they're doing when they go there. They think the spectacle of all these birds suddenly leaving the cliffs and flying around above their head is something wonderful to see. They don't seem to be aware that they're disturbing those birds, and they could actually be threatening the lives of the young birds and possibly pushing the eggs off the cliff there as well. So disturbance there is a problem, and that's down to awareness, and I think there could be a little bit more done on to help people become aware of what they're doing there. The management of the headland itself is probably as important as anything else, and the species you get there are reliant on that sort of habitat of grassland and a little bit of scrub and a bit of woodland cover as well. As far as the guillemots go, there's nothing you can really do as far as conservation goes, apart from trying to restrict people getting in close to the colony and disturbing them when they're nesting. It is used by all sorts of people for different reasons. I go there as a bird watcher to watch the birds. Other people go to Berryhead to walk the dogs. For me, that gets quite frustrating sometimes, but I've come to accept that the headland is there for all sorts of people to use and use it for different reasons. And I think you've just got to accept that. There will be disturbance, and you just hope that there'll be areas where the birds can be left to get on and do their own thing without being disturbed.
Now, the bats really didn't come to Berryhead till probably the mid to late 60s, and that was after the quarrying had actually finished at Berryhead, man's quarrying of the headland, and this is because the bats actually use caves. And the caves are crucially important because they use it for breeding purposes, but also hibernation.
There's a wide range of species that have been recorded here. The species that is of most interest is the greater horseshoe bat, and that's the focus of most people's attention and concern.
But also the cowpats are crucially important, because the cowpats are in fact the most important factor for the feeding of the greater horseshoe bats. So on that side of things, if you have an organic cow, then you have more beetles within the cowpats.
What you have to consider about the population that we have here at Berryhead is that it's part of a much bigger, broader population for South Devon generally, and it's clearly linked in some way. We're not exactly sure to what extent or how that linking mechanism works. The sort of issues that greater horseshoe face, and this is true of all bat species, it's development, but critically as part of development, increases in external lighting. So we know that most bat species, including greater horseshoe bats, are what we call strongly light averse. In other words, they don't like flying in areas that are well illuminated. The trend these days is increases and increases and increases in levels of nighttime illumination, and that may be from street lighting, from increasing the level of lighting that we put on our homes, but also the amount of light that comes from through glass, through glazing, what we call domestic light spillage. So when you have development, the broader countryside becomes more illuminated. And so for greater horseshoe bats and other bat species as well, it actually is becoming increasingly difficult for these bats to navigate through the countryside because it's becoming so illuminated. And when you have a site like Brixham, the berryhead bats, Berryhead's a peninsula. Most of it is out to sea, and the actual route, the flight corridor that the greater horseshoe bats have away from their roost into the broader countryside, they've basically got to skirt round the urban sprawl of Brixham. That corridor, that dark, non-illumined corridor, is really narrow, and as a result it's really, really vulnerable. And one of the greatest vulnerabilities to this particular colony is the sort of incremental increasing lighting that may eventually prevent the bats getting, to and from the roost.
From my point of view, we're running a business, so what we need is people, as many people as possible to come, which is kind of the opposite of what the rangers probably would like. They probably don't want too many people to be here, because the more people there are, the more degradation there is to the site. We want to be able to run evening events, and especially it's such a lovely spot on a summer's evening. We'd love to be able to do things like weddings, but there is a colony of greater horseshoe bats living in the quarry, and those are very heavily protected bats. And actually our area of the fort is fine, but the bats are known, not particularly many of them necessarily, but some of them definitely fly down the other side of that wall as one of their routes to and from their roost, and then they go further down past the car park. There is a concern within the environmental world that any people coming in the evening after dark might really disturb those bats. So there's a ruling which is that we are not allowed to run our business after sunset for about 2/3 of the year. So from my point of view, that's an annoyance, and that's definitely an example of where there's a conflict between like the human/business needs and the environmental needs. I'll say overall we try to work pretty much in harmony with the rangers and the headland, because we fully appreciate that we only have a chance to have a successful business here because this is such a beautiful area, and there's a lot of things that we do try to do then, therefore, to make sure that we're playing our part in looking after the area as well.
There are efforts that can be made to improve roosting conditions within the breeding site. There are, as I've already said, other measures that can be taken to maintain core habitat features, maintain and enhance habitat features, both directly in proximity to these breeding roosts and within the broader landscape. And again, it's a question of making sure that the bats can get from A to B as effectively as possible, and then once they're in the broader habitat, that they've got good areas and a variety of areas where they can feed successfully as well. And a lot of that is to do with, say, grazing levels and planting and so on.
When I first came across these porpoises and I did my first set of statistics and started to notice this correlation that marine vessels are impacting the porpoises. And then there's all this other research around noise pollution and this whole starvation thing, all these other things, and the bycatch, they're getting hammered from every angle. So I just felt from a personal standpoint that this animal that people always mistake for a dolphin, they don't even get their own kind of glory. it's up to me to do something about that. I've actually read some papers that call them a sentry species, which is basically they indicate a healthy ecosystem. So if there's harbour porpoises, that means that there's mackerel, that means that there's good productivity in the water, plankton. It just shows if you've got an apex predator at the top, you've got everything else working underneath. The kind of research around harbour porpoises states that they should be eating oilier fish, but because of the state of their energetic output and input, they just take anything they can get. They'll eat anything they can fit in their mouths, basically. There isn't too much effort to get to. You know, they need to maintain that energy. We began the summer of 2017 in May, and we studied the porpoises throughout May to July. And the research that we ascertained from that data collection was that as marine traffic increases, porpoise behaviour changes and porpoise presence and like observations of porpoises actually decreases. And we've noticed that just through a behavioural ethogram, we've ascertained that the porpoises that use the water below Berryhead spend over 80% of their time feeding. Harbour porpoises are particularly sensitive to starvation. There's a scientist in Denmark who actually made the statement that they're living on an energetic knife edge and that they're constantly living on the edge of starvation. They need to eat so much per day just to stay alive, basically. And then additionally, they need to reproduce, they need to move, like all of those things that take energy. And if marine vessel traffic is interrupting this behaviour on a regular basis, in addition to behaviours that are really important, such as resting, these animals are expending far more energy than they're taking in. And if they're getting disturbed by marine traffic, which is constantly going through the area, and they're feeling stressed by it and their cortisol levels are rising, or generally they have to scarper or get away from these boats because of the noise and the presence of them, they're going to be suffering, basically. I often see people approaching the porpoises and other marine mammals like dolphins, whales, seals in boats, which is actually illegal. It's illegal to disturb, therefore approach, swim with, try to injure or anything like that. It's illegal in the UK. They're heavily protected animals, and rightly so, but people don't necessarily know that. Anyone can buy a boat, anyone can drive a boat. You don't necessarily need a license to drive a boat. It's recommended, but even if you do that, you're not going to get any wildlife knowledge or education. It's purely how to drive a boat safely. So what I would like to do, and one of the main things I want to focus on, is getting the knowledge out there to anyone and everyone I can to understand how important it is to watch from and admire from afar, and not to have to go and get close to these things or touch them. You know, we have these wonderful things called binoculars and cameras, so you can see these things from afar. You don't have to chase them, you don't have to pursue them, you don't have to stress them any more than they already are. So that's the main thing I want to do. But also through this data, we're just going to get a really good view of what these porpoises are doing there, why the area is really important and why it's important that we should protect them.
The volunteers now are a crucial part of the management and helping run the site, looking after the site, from manning visitor centres, but also to do habitat and scrub bashing, if you want to call it that.
There's a small group of very enthusiastic people who live locally, who love Berryhead, and before I was involved here, they formed this group called the Friends of Berryhead. So they do little things like going around litter picking, or manning the visitor centre, which is manned by volunteers, some of them for 1 or 2 days every week for many weeks of the year. They also do some fundraising. There's a new guillemot camera which is installed down on the cliffs here, which allows the TV screen within the visitor centre has a live feed of the guillemot colony for however many months of the year they're on the cliffs. but the Trust has a very limited budget to spend on projects which are not absolutely essential, so that's generally where the Friends steps in and does some good things. But I'll say the main impact they have is their time that they all volunteer to do nice things for looking after people.
It's almost certainly down to volunteers. I don't think the rangers have much time to monitor. I know the volunteer rangers, so they are still volunteers, but they are rangers at Berryhead. They carry out the counts of the guillemot colonies during the springtime. So effectively that's staff, I suppose, carrying out the surveys, but they are volunteers. Other than that, there are plenty of other volunteers which go down and help out with those counts. And a couple of years ago, we're monitoring disturbance of the guillemot colony as well, so that was all down to volunteer work.
In some ways, you could say that what the headland needs is some sort of volunteer coordinator who in fact actually coordinates everybody. So there is one particular person that everything comes through on that volunteer side of things, and that person then goes from there to people who are passive to the extent of do visitor centre work, to others that want to just get there and work out in the environment and everything like that. And therefore on that side of things that can be quite difficult, but they need to coordinate that all to be able to in fact actually so there is the response and the people don't feel that they're being ignored and everything like that. The headland can sustain high numbers of people, but it is in fact making sure that those people, rather than fencing off great areas and things like this and saying you can't go there and things like that, you psychologically manipulate people to use the headland as you wish them to use it. So yes, put paths in that are going to guide people, but don't say you must walk these paths. And that is again majorly crucial, that people can disperse and enjoy the headland as a whole. You enjoy it, you respect it, and long-term wise that means that they are the kind of people that will in fact actually work with you in conservation and preserving the headland as a nature reserve and a national nature reserve.